Not the vaguest notion. From SAS Rogue Heroes, the Authorized Wartime History by Ben McIntyre. Surgeon Captain Marcus Lutterotti, or Baron Marcus von Lutterotti de Gazolis und Langetal, to give him his full civilian title, was enjoying the joyride over the desert. The plane trip was a welcome break from the monotony of treating the desert sores and other ailments of the German troops. From the passenger seat of the Fischler Storch, a reconnaissance plane, the young doctor looked down on a flat wasteland that seemed to stretch away to infinite emptiness. He had never seen anywhere so utterly devoid of life. Lutterotti wanted to inspect the desert at close quarters and stretch his legs, so he ordered the pilot to land. The Luftwaffe sergeant, Rommel's personal pilot, did not disguise his irritation. For an hour he had been flying aimlessly around the desert, for no purpose other than to entertain this young officer. He began the descent, barely bothering to see what might be below, since it all looked exactly the same to him. Neither man spotted the camouflaged vehicles lurking beneath a low escarpment. Captain Lutterotti wore a German uniform, but he would have been offended to be described as German, and even more put out by any suggestion that he was a Nazi. The Lutterottis were Catholic aristocrats from South Tyrol, the German-speaking region of northern Italy, once part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and annexed by the Italians after the First World War. Italy's German-speaking minority was distrusted by Mussolini, and Marcus's outspoken father had fallen foul of the fascist authorities. The oldest of 8 children, Marcus had been obliged to complete Italian military service after his medical exams, and was briefly deployed to the Horn of Africa following Mussolini's invasion and occupation of Abyssinia. His time in Africa had sparked an interest in tropical medicine, and on returning to Europe, he studied at the Hamburg Tropical Institute. The war put a halt to his career in academic medicine. Signing up with the Afrika Korps seemed the best way to escape having to join the Nazi Party. Deployed to North Africa at the beginning of 1941, Lutterotti took part in the May Offensive and then ran a small tented hospital at Bardia behind the German lines. Perfectly bilingual, his language skills made him as sought after as a translator for both Italian and German officers. He had even translated for Rommel and deeply admired the Afrika Korps commander. A man of liberal convictions and professional dedication, he insisted on treating North Africans, Allied prisoners, and his own comrades with precisely the same level of care. Gentle, inquisitive, and scholarly, Marcus Lutterotti was not made for the blunt brutalities of war. During the advance, he had come across a mortally wounded soldier screaming in a trench beyond help. He put him out of his pain with a massive dose of morphine. The incident would mark him forever. Germany would win the war Luterotti was sure of that, but the prospect did not fill him with particular elation. He was 29, he wanted the fighting to end, he wanted to resume his study of tropical medicine, and he wanted to return to the mountains of South Tyrol. But first he wanted to see the open desert. It had been easy to persuade his commanding officer to lend him a reconnaissance plane and a pilot for the afternoon. The Viercle Storch touched down gently in the sand, a few hundred yards from two burnt-out trucks, relics from the British retreat. Luterotti and the pilot climbed down, lit cigarettes, and set off, laughing and talking, to inspect the wrecks. At that moment, a vehicle suddenly hurtled into view, painted a peculiar combination of pink and green, and manned by bearded, shouting men wearing Arab headdresses. Assuming that this must be a German patrol, albeit an odd one, Luterotti stepped forward to greet them, only to be stopped dead by a deafening burst of gunfire. The bearded gunners were strafing the stationary plane. The look of astonishment on Luterotti's face was comical to behold. He whipped a Red Cross armband out of his pocket and waved it above his head. "You can't shoot me," he shouted in English. "I'm a doctor." Lieutenant Nick Wilder of the LRDG had been returning from a diversionary raid on Bagush airfield, timed to coincide with a massed jeep attack, when this unexpected prize dropped from the sky. Wilder's men planted bombs on the riddled Viercle Storch as the two amazed prisoners were bundled into the back of the truck. Luterotti watched the plane explode as they sped away. The two doctors lounged in the cooling sand after supper, discussing medicine, the war, and luck. "It was a joy cruise," Marcus Luterotti explained to an amused Malcolm Playdell. "I went up for pleasure, and it turned unhappily. C'est la guerre." This earnest, bespectacled doctor was a good chap, Playdell decided. Captives were not part of the SAS remit. "Generally, we didn't take prisoners," Seekings later recalled. "I don't mean by that we shot them out of hand." They were usually disarmed, briefly held, and then released. But out there in the deep desert, simply abandoning prisoners would have been tantamount to killing them. Instead, Stirling had offered Luterotti parole, the ancient military convention under which a captive would be left unguarded in return for a solemn promise not to escape. Luterotti had smiled at this quaint suggestion. "What would you do in my position?" he asked. Stirling laughed. "I certainly wouldn't accept parole." "Then nor will I." Luterotti was handed over to Playdell with orders to keep the prisoner under close guard at all times. The two captain doctors discovered that they had much in common. Luterotti had spent several childhood holidays in Clacton-on-Sea, spoke excellent English, and seemed more intrigued than alarmed to find himself in an enemy camp so far behind the lines. At one point during supper, The Tyrolean aristocrat overheard the name Jellicoe and piped up. "Not Lord Jellicoe?" George Jellicoe nodded. "I think you know my wife," said Luterotti. It is a small world, even in the vast desert. The Earl Jellicoe and Baroness Luterotti, it transpired, had become acquainted at a formal lunching in Hamburg in 1936. Jellicoe was an energetic ladies' man, and word swiftly spread around the camp that the Earl had done rather more than just lunch with the Baron's wife. The camp at Bir el Qusir was becoming too comfortable for comfort. Stirling announced that they would be shifting camp again, 30 miles to the west, before launching another intensive series of raids on the German supply lines. The targets, Stirling promised, would be very enticing. As they settled into the new camp, the doctor's unlikely friendship deepened. They talked of tropical diseases, the problem of flies, the role of the Red Cross and the BBC, which Luterotti had often listened to in secret back in Bardia. They even began to pool medical expertise on the subject of desert sores. Only when the conversation shifted to the future of the conflict did the atmosphere turn chilly. "Do you think you're going to win the war?" asked Pleydell. "Yes, I think so." "Soon?" "In about 2 years." Luterotti's bland certainty was unsettling and nettling. The possibility of defeat had never been broached during Pleydell's time with the SAS. "Well, how about Egypt now? Do you think you will be able to conquer us here?" "Yes, I think we will take Egypt in 2 months." Luterotti was not aggressive, merely confident. It was said quietly, Pleydell noted, without a hint of swagger. The embarrassed silence was eventually broken by Luterotti. "And you say you will win the war?" "Yes," said Pleydell, defensively. "Then how are you going to beat Germany?" Pleydell was about to launch into a passionate prediction of inevitable Allied victory, but then stopped himself. "When I thought of our present situation, of the way we were just hanging on for our dear lives to a little strip of desert in front of Alexandria, of how we seemed to have our backs to the wall everywhere, I became aware that I had not got the vaguest notion as to how we would win the war." The thought was somehow very funny. Pleydell snorted with laughter. Suddenly, both men were rolling around in the sand, giggling helplessly. "I don't think he really understood what I was laughing about," Pleydell later wrote. "And for the life of me, I could not have explained it."